Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 244 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. There's an old saying that tells us that we should walk a mile in someone else's shoes. It's meant to remind us that we should practice empathy and really try to understand people before we cast judgment. Now, history is a field that helps us develop and practice empathy, as we're always trying to get at information that tells us how and why people acted as they did, how they lived. And as it happens, that expression that we can walk in shoes and use them to better understand people is really right on the mark. Because it seems that when we use shoes as historical objects, we can learn a lot about people and their everyday lives and actions. Kimberly Alexander is a curatorial expert who specializes in reading clothes for information about the past. And over the last 8 years, she's been researching and reading shoes to better understand what they can tell us about the lives of both their makers and their wearers. So today, we're going to metaphorically walk in some of the shoes early Americans left behind. And as we walk, Kimberly reveals how we can read shoes for information and what they can tell us about early America, how early Americans purchased shoes and the work 18th century shoemakers performed to produce them, and why early Americans made certain fashion choices and how politics informed some of the fashion choices they made. But first, have you ever wondered why we celebrate American independence on the 4th of July when the Continental Congress voted for independence on the 2nd of July? If so, you're in for a real treat, because next week, our annual 4th of July special episode will answer questions about how and why we celebrate the 4th of July. This should be a really fun episode, and it would be great if you could share Ben Franklin's World with someone you know this week so that they can take part in the fun too. Plus, the best way for podcasts to find new listeners is through word-of-mouth support. So by telling someone you know about Ben Franklin's World and letting them know about our special episode, you'll be helping me spread the word about this podcast. Okay, are you ready to find out what shoes can teach us about early America and early Americans? Let's be on our way then. Our guest teaches in the history department at the University of New Hampshire, and she has held curatorial positions at several New England museums, including the MIT Museum, the Peabody Essex Museum, and Strawberry Bank. She's also published many articles and essays, and a book, Treasures Afoot, Shoe Stories from the Georgian Era. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Kimberly Alexander.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back.
And it's been a while, hasn't it? We first spoke in episode 24 about 18th century fashion, and since then, you've gone on to write a book called Treasures Afoot, which is all about shoes in early America.
Yes, I have. It was an 8-year project, actually, sort of the amount of time that went into thinking about the shoes, doing the research, visiting collections. I think I visited about 30 different collections. I've looked at hundreds of shoes, maybe more. I probably would be embarrassed to say how many photos I've taken. And it's been incredibly rewarding and has opened my eyes to a whole nother way of thinking about history.
Yeah, that's what you were saying in Treasures Afoot, that shoes can really tell us a lot of stories that we wouldn't associate with or otherwise read about early America.
Yeah, and I think what I am particularly interested in, the book largely focuses on the shoes of women and women's stories. So it's been a real opportunity to tell stories about women through their shoes, which in some cases is the only remaining tangible artifact we have to their history, other than in some cases when they were born, who they married, and when they died. So for me, having the chance to work with objects associated with women and bring their stories out of the shadow, give them a voice where possible, has been incredibly rewarding. The idea of having agency in terms of what one selects or holds on to, these are all part of this process, and they can be tied very tightly to shoes.
Shoes really do seem like a fascinating historical source, and I wondered how you became interested in shoes and how we, as people who are interested in the past, can use shoes as a source of information about early America.
one of the things that we always, as historians think about is, well, how do you start your research? One of the things I always say is, well, what are the questions you want to ask? Who's telling the stories and who's left out of the stories? And that's actually the approach I use myself. And when I was at Strawberry Bank Museum as the chief curator, I was doing research on textiles and costumes. And in the collection, came across a single shoe. In fact, it's the shoe on the cover of the book. So it has sort of its own origin story, if you will. But I looked at the shoe and I'd never really seen anything quite like it. To me, it's beautiful. It's a brocaded silk, a woven silk with a lovely pattern. It has a 2.5-inch heel. We know who donated it, but we don't know who wore it. But in the instep of the shoe, in the footbed, was a label. And it said Rideout and Davis, shoemakers, near Aldgate, London. And it was seeing this teeny label in the shoe that got me wondering, well, what was the journey of this artifact, this object? How did it go from being made in London and end up in the collection here at Strawberry Bank? And that prompted a whole series of other questions that ultimately led to the research.
As you were looking at this mystery shoe with its maker's label right inside it, how did you go about reading the shoe for information? Documents contain words, and we can use those words and the context in which they were written to get information. But what does the process of information gathering and reading look like for a shoe?
Well, it's interesting. The information that I can now gather from a shoe, as you can imagine, is much greater now after, almost a decade of looking at shoes than it would have been in the beginning. This is definitely a case of the more things you look at, the more you understand them. So things that I look at, they're two sort of separate issues. There's the issue of the wearer and the issue of the maker. And so in this case, I had an idea of who the maker of this particular shoe was because of the shoe label. So I was able to do research on these two cordwainers, shoemakers, as we call them in early America, and find out where they were located. I started to put together a whole body of work created by these particular shoemakers in American and British collections. And I learned quite a bit about their training, their background. They both were apprentices in London. They became masters of their trade, master cordwainers, and so on. So that was sort of looking at the maker, Rideout and Davis. But what about the wearer? How can you tell that, especially if you don't know who wore them or who they belong to? Well, there's certain things you can see, just like any of us today. If you look at the back of a pair of shoes, if you have the pair or even one, you can see if somebody maybe had an overpronation of their gait, if they favored one leg over the other in their walk, if they scuffed their toes, if they walked on the balls of their feet. You can see wear patterns on the outsides of the heel and the sole. You can also see wear patterns inside the shoe. And you can also start to identify where shoes have been changed and altered, sometimes for fashion. Maybe the toe of a shoe is changed. We find this particularly in the 1760s and 1770s in American shoes because people were holding on to their shoes. So fashion played some role, but also we find that age played a role. Someone might cut down their 2.5-inch heel to be a flat because they were older and maybe had some sort of a foot problem. We can see marks from bunions. We can see the fact that some shoes probably expanded with the wearer's ensuing pregnancies. All of these things you can start to get a sense of once you really look at the object in front of you.
And those are really personal details that someone never would have written in a journal or some sort of document, but they just wore into their shoes.
Exactly. And that's what's so wonderful about shoes. There's always going to be some, and pardon the pun, but some part of a footprint which is indelible in the way people wear their shoes. And I think that's what's fascinating. It is this personal aspect that never leaves the shoe that's been worn.
So what do you do with this information that you gather from a shoe? Do you take what you found, say the shoemaker's name, the fact that someone had the shoe altered? Do you take this information into the written archive and see what more you can find? Or do you have other ways that you can use this information to expand upon it and find out more about both the shoemaker and the shoe wearer?
That's where it gets interesting because the shoe can tell you so much, but then what might you be able to learn through biography? for example, or through other extant artifacts, perhaps from the same family or even the same wearer. And what I've attempted to do in the book is sometimes I start with a document, sometimes I start with an object. George Washington is a great example. We have some extant shoe buckles that are at Mount Vernon, but at least so far, we have no extant pairs of George Washington's shoes. But we have copious records because he was nothing if not a detailed record keeper and somebody who was very concerned about sartorial natures. And we see that he had lengthy correspondence over a dozen years with a shoemaker from London named John Didsbury. And when you start to go through the letters that he wrote to Didsbury via his factors, Carey and Company, you realize you can see the type of shoe that he would have worn and also a bit of his taste, which was very conservative, particularly when you compare that with the shoes he was requesting for his stepson, Jackie, who was looking for something perhaps a little bit more stylish. So here, without the object, I could start with the written record and put together this sort of information about what the shoes would have looked like. And thanks to the help of other scholars, in this case, particularly Al Segudo, boot and shoemaker emeritus at Colonial Williamsburg, put together the size of Washington's shoes, which are about today's contemporary 9.5, I believe, or 10. And also something about his requirements for those who were making clothing for him, which were very, very high standard. On the other hand, in some cases, there's a pair of wedding shoes that belong to a woman named Mary Wise Farley. And Mary Wise Farley is not anyone who is a household name, not someone that many people would have heard of. She grew up in what is now Ipswich, Massachusetts. And if you did a biographical search, all you would find out about her would be who her father was, who her husband was, and that she had one child, essentially. However, in the course of my research, I came across a pair of her shoes. And it's fascinating because what you realize looking at the shoes is that she had a disability. Now, this is something that we would never have known, something that's not often talked about in the historical record, but she had her wedding shoes crafted to meet her needs. So that one shoe is about 2¼ inches taller than the other, which has a heel of about 1.5 inches. So it was to balance out the length of her legs. Now, why might she do this? In those days, if you had a disability, lame as they called it at that time, you probably wore a pair of heavy leather shoes that were built up on the inside or the outside, not terribly attractive. But she decided she wanted these silk brocade shoes on her wedding. So even if it was for just that one day, she took agency about how she wanted to be a bride, to enjoy what others enjoyed. And so she had these shoes custom made to fit her. And so to me, that's an amazing story, which we would know nothing about were it not for the fact that her family preserved her shoes.
It really does sound like shoes can help us expand our knowledge of the past and really get at the deliberateness of people's actions, choices, and fashion preferences in ways that documents simply can't.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's another key point, and that comes up particularly as we start moving toward the non-importation agreements and the growing friction of the 1760s and 70s regarding home manufacture and supporting your local artisans and local tradespeople over importing shoes from London shoemakers like Rideout and Davis or John Hose or John Didsbury. And so that shoes become, not everywhere, but in many quarters become quite politicized. And I think that's fascinating too. So shoes are playing to, in some cases, fashion and fashion consciousness. They can allow us to look at biography, tell stories, but the shoes wrapped up in the political discussion, I also find to be very fascinating.
And we definitely want to talk about the politics of shoes during the American Revolution. But I think it would be really helpful for us to first talk about how and where the shoes early Americans wore were manufactured. So would you tell us about the men and women who produced shoes during the 18th century and a bit about their work?
Absolutely. One of the things that I've enjoyed very much in the process of the research for this book was going through account books and day books of shoemakers. A number of them are at the Phillips Library of the Peabody Essex Museum for shoemakers who are not well known, who supported their local communities. Samuel Lane in Stratham, New Hampshire is probably one of the best known examples because he kept about 60 years of records of the shoes that he made and who bought them and so on. Very, very detailed. And there's some similarities between what's happening in the local New England and in the British shoe trade in terms of process. There's generally a master, somebody who's trained, who has fulfilled an apprenticeship, who has then gone on to be a journeyman and has become a master. The apprenticeship system was obviously prevalent in Britain, and it continued to be prevalent in colonial America. In fact, I found an apprenticeship indenture from as late as 1802, and another one is about 1810 for shoemakers who are still going through their apprenticeship with a master shoemaker. So there is one commonality sort of on both sides, which is this idea of training and apprenticeship. But there's some other parts of this that are less well understood. Certainly in Britain, when you have somebody like a John Hose who is producing trunk after trunk after trunk, thousands and thousands of shoes for export, he is functioning as a designer and really is overseeing a number of the administrative duties. But who's actually making the shoes? They're going to be journeymen and apprentices in his shop. But one of the things we often wonder is, well, what role did women play in this trade? And part of if you think of the make of a shoe, you have the sole and the heel, and then you have what's known as the upper, the piece that covers your foot is the best way to describe it. Shoes at this time, during the long 18th century, were largely shoes that were held on with buckles. So they have a cross piece in the front called a latchet or straps, and the shoes were called buckle shoes. Well, so how were the uppers created if it was a silk shoe? You would have purchased woven silk brocade bits from a place like Spitalfields or another secondary provider, and then had them cut to size for your client, would be one way. But often women would embroider shoe uppers and would be paid by their embroidery per piece. And that was called piecework. So you had vamps that could be done in pieces. And then you had families who might be involved in cutting out. Men's heels tended to be leather, stacked leather heels like we see today. But somebody had to cut all those pieces out. Those were pieceworks. You also could have somebody who would just carve heels, wooden heels for women's shoes. So these parts of the business are, in some ways, you could think of as early prefab, although ultimately most of the shoes are going to be custom made or bespoke at this elite level. It's going to be a little different when you start looking at the shoes that were purchased by more middling sorts or those who are working. In early America, the process was much the same. You had a master shoemaker or cordwainer, maybe a journeyman, maybe an apprentice, depending on where someone was located, or you might just have the shoemaker making shoes on his own. Somebody like Sam Lane in Stratham, New Hampshire, would give parts of his production out to his neighbors during the winter months, and they would put together the heels and the bits of soles or the uppers and the vamps, and then they would be put together by those in his office, or in his shop, I should say. So the idea of the community in the New England shoemaking tradition is a little different than the more sort of anonymous makers that you're going to find in a major metropolis like London. Primarily, you find shoes made during this time of the highly desirable ones are made of silk or a wool, which was generally, you could have a worsted or you could have a calamanco. Calamanco shoes were worsted wool, but the wool was treated, was called calendered. It was put through hot rollers, which glazed the surface. And that accomplished two things that were desirable in the 18th century. One is it gave the shoe a bit of a luster and a shine. And the whole sort of Baroque, Rococo aesthetic of luster and shine was part of just the visual lexicon of the age. So by putting these through hot rollers, you had a little bit of a shine. And it also meant it was slightly impervious to bad weather, which was particularly desirable in New England. If your silk shoe got wet, it was likely to stain. if a Kalamanco shoe got wet, you could do some spot treating and go along your way. Leather shoes would become more popular for middling and upper sorts in the later 18th century, but leather work shoes were always go-to for those who were spending a lot of time on their feet or doing manual labor.
So now that we know a bit about how shoes were made and about the sheer variety of materials and parts that could go into a shoe, if you were an early American and you wanted to buy a new pair of shoes, where did you go and what would you be looking for in a shoe?
Right. Well, it depends again. A lot of it is location, location, location. One of the big differences, of course, that we find is the way goods in general are purchased between the northern colonies and the southern colonies. Shoes are no different. The Virginia planters, again, the Washingtons or the Pinckneys, will be ordering their shoes largely in bulk from London through their factors. That's not to say that there were not plenty of shoemakers who you could visit in a place like Williamsburg, for example, where we know there were shoemakers. And we could get into a topic of the shoes of the enslaved as well, which is a topic that I'm working on quite a bit at the moment. In the North, you tended to have a local shoemaker like a Sam Lane or a Lazier Pope in Salem who would take care of the local population. So you would go in and you might ask for a pair of shoes. The shoemaker may well have your last. In other words, your shoe size, a wooden last for your shoe, and he would measure your foot and then adapt a shoe to that. Somebody like a Sam Lane had such a good reputation that people would seek him out and ask for his shoes to be made because they knew that they lasted a long time, they wore well, they were good quality. Other shoemakers, the quality was perhaps not so good. And because of that, we don't find as many very poor quality shoes in the archives. We find some where you can see that somebody's still trying to work out all the details of how to sew the last and so on, or the stitching is not as neat. But if it was a really bad pair of shoes, chances are they were not long for this world. So you would seek out, just as people do now, brands that suit them. John Hose in London was a brand name. People knew his shoes. They knew they were good. They knew they were desirable. They were great for special occasions. And we find them being purchased all up and down the eastern seaboard. Somebody like John Didsbury was a big favorite with the southern planters. And I have yet to find any reference to him in any New England shoe collections. So there are some differences in terms of where the clientele turns. But a large part of your shoe needs are going to be met by somebody locally. There's also a little bit of a sense of itinerancy involved with some local shoemakers. So, for example, Sam Lane will write about someone who comes in to have not only himself, but his entire family fitted for shoes. And then he may deliver them when they're finished. He will take his wares to the square in Portsmouth for market days to barter for other goods for his family. So the idea of how much a shoe is worth and valued changes quite a bit as well. So there were a number of shoemakers who were trying to say that they were as good as Sam Lane, others who were saying they were as good as the shoemakers in Lynn. Lynn had an excellent reputation for making ladies' shoes early on, and then later during the American Revolution for turning out boots for the troops. So there certainly was a very strong underpinning of shoemaking before the Revolution that was trying to gain an upper hand on some of the British imports. But there's still times when the elite, Martha Washingtons, the Dorothy Hancocks, will even right up within a year or two of the Revolution, will still be purchasing London-made shoes. So it's an interesting and very sort of fluid world as far as the footwear is concerned. The other thing is that once so many of the importation agreements coming into place, you find more and more shoes that have been altered. And in New England, I would say roughly 50% of the shoes that I've looked at have had some sort of alteration, probably either a repair or an update rather than buying new shoes because they were valuable. The textiles that made them were costly.
I'm sitting here stunned that there were designer labels during the 18th century. And I guess I shouldn't really be surprised by this, but it's just something I've never thought about. And the fact that there seemed to be the equivalent of designer labels in early America is just, well, I guess it is surprising to me.
Right. And we don't see the labels appearing in shoes coming from London until about the 1740s or 50s. So it is an early idea of branding. You have your location, your name. Later on, you might say what you specialized in, whether it was like women's shoes or boots. And specialization will increase throughout the century as well. But then there are many people who never label their shoes, ever. And so, for example, we have one, despite the fact that Sam Lane and his father before him, his brother, his sons, the entire Lane family was engaged in the shoemaking business for 80 years and were a name that people respected. We have one example of a shoe that was handed down in the family, and none of them were labeled. Same with Didsbury, who was creating shoes for George Washington. I've yet to find a labeled Didsbury shoe. So there are other things that we can only, as I've started to look at shoes, I can make some assumptions about whether it was made in London or perhaps whether it was made in Bristol or Norwich, or I can also take a look at the stitching and the heel shape of shoes and have a fairly good idea if it was made in the colonies versus whether it was made in Britain, because in the sort of years leading up to the Revolution, the skill set was not quite the same for American shoemakers. There is an exception to that. Right about 1774, 1775, there's a shoemaker, and luckily he labeled his shoes. His name was Winthrop Gray, Captain Winthrop Gray, and he came from a Salem and then Lynn shoemaking background. He went to Boston. We have one pair of shoes that he labeled, and it has a Masonic symbol also on the label. And he enlisted in 1775. So we have this one pair of shoes that he had to complete before he enlisted. And it shows an amazing amount of polish and finish and easily could compete with a European or English shoe. So it was like the Rosetta Stone of shoes for me in terms of how you unlock some of the other mysteries.
So it sounds like most Americans would have had their shoes made locally by a shoemaker who lived near them. But it also sounds like at least elite Americans were importing a lot of shoes from London. And I wonder, did early Americans who imported their shoes always import from England, or did you happen to find that they were also importing shoes from other places?
First, let me get back to the import idea. One of the things that also happens that I think is something that we tend not to focus on as much is the secondhand clothing trade. Because if you were sending secondhand goods rather than new goods, the duties were far less or even insignificant. So every one of the sort of auction houses that I've come across advertising in newspapers, Garish's and Lang's in Boston and in Portsmouth and so on, it's really interesting because it's understood that they have all their new fancy auction items, things that have just come from an estate or from a foreclosure or have just come over from the ship where someone couldn't make a payment. But there's always the back room, which is where they kept secondhand clothes and things like secondhand shoes. There was even a task, a job called a translator, where someone would actually recreate a shoe from bits and pieces of older shoes to try and make it look like something stylish. So if you were of the middling sort and you had some income, you could buy into the aesthetics of consumption. You could go and buy a piece of fancy gold lace ribbon that could be attached to your clothing. You could find a pair of shoes or a pair of shoe buckles. And this was just understood. They didn't have a big need to advertise it publicly all the time. The lines are something like, in terms as usual, in the back room or in the second room. And so this is something that is also supplying a major part of the non-elite market, is the secondhand production or the secondhand availability of clothing, and shoes were a big part of that. As far as different, if you were importing shoes from different European countries, depending on your country of origin, one thing you don't see a lot of, for example, are French shoes. Until post-revolution, we have very few pairs of French shoes that show up. As far as Dutch shoes, not so much. They're probably scattered in specific regional collections that I may not have seen. We do know not a lot, but a good bit about shoes that were made by Quaker shoemakers for other Quakers. And that's something that I find quite a bit, is just as patriots are purchasing their shoes from those who they feel to be of their persuasion, we also have loyalists like Reverend Mather Biles purchasing from Inman, a loyalist merchant. And then we have Quakers like Elizabeth Drinker, who's only buying shoes from Quaker shoemakers. And I find that very fascinating.
It is fascinating. Now, were the altered shoes that you found, I think you said something like 50% of the shoes that you saw were altered. Were these altered shoes part of this secondhand market for clothing too?
I don't think that it is. Generally, the shoes that I've focused on that have brand names and labels, generally, and again, there are so many shoes that I haven't seen. There's almost, I don't know what percentage of collections has at least one or two pairs of shoes that somebody gave to the Historical Society or the museum or even the archive. But there does seem to be a trend that, for example, if you were, and I think you asked this question about wedding shoes, you would maybe buy the very best pair of shoes you could afford for your wedding. And one example I use in the book is the shoes of Mary Rand, who got married, has a pair of host shoes, and then she ends up leaving Boston with very little. Unfortunately, her child dies in Boston, and these shoes she kept with her and then obviously passed down. But alterations would be made to this best pair of shoes that you could afford in this time of scarcity. So I can see what's happening and the results. Only sometimes can I actually tell you why. And that's usually has to do with the date of production and what the family history might have been. So for example, one of the most curious things to me is that there are about 3 pairs of shoes that belong to Dorothy Hancock at the Bostonian Society. Now, we know that the Hancocks were constantly being uprooted and they were moving. They were even broken into at one point when they moved to Baltimore and lost all their goods. But somehow during all of this, either she put aside for safekeeping or left with somebody shoes, probably wedding shoes that were important to her. So the way these things end up coming down to us also is often quite haphazard and doesn't necessarily follow a direct chain of events. So the alterations can be due to holding on to your shoes because you are not going to buy British shoes because of your politics. They can be because simply the sheer value of the investment. So you keep on wearing the shoes. You bought them for your wedding shoes, but then you wear them for church and for other important events. Or you have them altered because of something physical, perhaps that has to do with your movement and mobility.
So at this point, we know that shoes were altered. We know that some people purchased really nice shoes for their wedding day. And we know that some people, like Dorothy Hancock, owned as many as 3 pairs of shoes. So from the evidence that we have thus far, it really sounds like shoes were expensive. So how much did shoes cost in the 18th century? And just how many pairs of shoes would an average person in early America have owned?
How many pairs? I'll start with that because it's very hard to get a handle on that. And it's not for lack of trying. The best sense we get is actually through the letters and the accounts of the elite, because they are ordering many pairs of shoes. George Washington is ordering, for one part of a year, he's ordering 46 pairs of shoes for himself, for Martha Washington, for his stepchildren, and for the enslaved who are running the household. And so you can see how they're parceled out between how many pairs were for Martha and so on. But for most people, we don't have that sense of how many pairs of shoes they had at a given moment. Certainly in the middling sorts, the sense I have from discussions of like trading shoe buckles from one pair of shoes to another, because they were interchangeable, was that if you were doing well, you probably had a pair of work shoes or maybe 2 pairs of work shoes and then maybe a pair of or 2 of dress shoes. When you go to probate inventories, which is where you might hope to find information for both men and women about their shoes, you almost never find a reference to shoes because they were the sort of thing that you might give as a gift. It sounds odd to us now, but shoes were a great gift. If you had somebody who had helped take care of you during an illness, or you had a neighbor who you liked, or maybe your daughter or daughter-in-law, chances are you would give them your good shoes before you pass, or they could be picked up as part of the estate, but they're not mentioned in estate records. Occasionally, men's boots are, occasionally. So there's no real sense of, well, they found 6 dresses, 4 pairs of shoes, and, 1 pair of boots and a pair of clogs. We don't find that, unfortunately, in the probate. And just like we often don't find high-end clothing. Sometimes we do, but we don't always, because they had another value. Certainly in some inventories, the textiles were deemed as cash, in the same category as cash, because they held that much value. Actually, John Stiles writes about this when he's talking about the clothes of the people, when he's talking about England, but I imagine much the same was done here, is if you could buy a few pieces of textile, of cloth, of a waistcoat, something, anything even at a secondhand store, and lay it aside, it was like something for a rainy day when times got hard, that you actually had a currency, a value on the street that you could either trade or get money for. We don't think about things quite the same way. I mean, we do when you take your clothes maybe to a secondhand shop and whatever, but it was very prevalent at that time.
Well, we may not know how many pairs of shoes early Americans owned, but we do know from what you've said earlier that Americans used the shoes they owned, however many pairs that was, to display their politics. Right now, we need to take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. And after that moment, this is what I want us to dig into: how Americans use shoes as a sign of their politics. Designer labels and designer shoes in the 18th century? I really had no idea that this was a thing, but I guess it makes sense because certain makers and brands have a reputation for quality, utility, and appearance, and those aspects of goods are really important to many of us today, so why shouldn't they have been important to the people who came before us? Now, it's fitting that we're talking about fashion, because Ben Franklin's World has a shop where you can satisfy some of your fashion needs, like the need for quality, fashionable appearance. My Omohundro Institute colleague Martha Howard has made sure that benfranklins.world.com/shop is stocked with high-quality goods bearing the fashionable and high-quality design of this podcast. Plus, she's also commissioned special limited edition t-shirts to help you celebrate and commemorate the 4th of July. Really, what could be more fashionable on the 4th of July than a special Ben Franklin's World t-shirt? Seriously, you should check out these designs at benfranklins.world.com/shop. And while you're looking over your options, you should know that you can feel great about any purchase you make from benfranklins.world.com/shop. Because not only will your use of these goods help spread the word about Ben Franklin's World, they'll also generate some funds to help us keep this podcast going. So visit benfranklins.world.com/shop and order your new and fashionable Ben Franklin's World t-shirts, tote bags, and hoodies today. Kimberly, would you tell us how early Americans used shoes to display their loyalties during the American Revolution?
There are a few examples. The politics of shoes. You have huge numbers of shoes being imported from England. Georgie Riello, material culture scholar, notes in his writing that Britain exported something like 300,000 pairs of shoes in 1 year alone in 1760. And 42% of that number went to America. So this is this whole time of consumer consumption and pre-sort of revolution. These numbers we also have from the shoemaker John Hose himself, where he talks about how many thousands of pounds worth of shoes he ships to America every year. The power of the British shoemakers at that time was something that was going to be hard for American cordwainers to meet the same numbers. But they were already, before the revolution, gearing up to be able to accommodate the local market, both just before and after the revolution. In 1765, we find in a newspaper, actually in Philadelphia, a shoemaker, Alexander Rutherford, and he writes in his advertisement in the newspaper, he alerts his female customers, and I quote, "as are resolved to distinguish themselves by their patriotism and encouragement of American manufactures, that he makes and sells all sorts of worsted or wool shoes of all sizes, as neat and cheap as any imported from England." So he's making it possible for his customers to make a choice about the types of shoes that they purchase. And this continues. You see very vocal proponents of buying American manufacturers, particularly in the Newport Mercury in 1764 and 1765, where they actually name John Hose, one of the most prolific and successful of the London shoemakers. He's named by name as being somebody who is deleterious to America moving forward, and that women need to set aside these fripperies and gewgaws that have been sent from foreign countries in favor of local manufacturers such as Hall Brothers in Newport. And so these are dialogues that are happening in the newspaper. So we have Rutherford, a shoemaker, bringing up American politics about the importance of American manufacturers. You have somebody like John Hancock, who makes sure that he is clothing his household staff in shoes that were made locally in Lynn by Isaac Bassett, and we have receipts to that effect. One of my favorite examples is Isaac and Mary Viberd. Mary is written up as going to purchase tea in the shop of William Jackson, and basically it causes a backlash to her husband and his business. And her husband, Isaac, and this is 1770, takes out an ad in the newspaper and actually writes to contradict this and say, some evil person has said this about my wife, and I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially he says that no, she did not go in to buy the hated tea. She only went in to Jackson's shop to pick up shoes made in Lynn, which was, of course, totally acceptable because they were Lynn-made, local manufacturer. And he goes on to say that he will swear an oath to such an effect because he's so fearful that this is going to damage his business. So there's a lot swirling about at this time, and shoes are certainly a major part of that. But we wouldn't necessarily think of that, I think, at first blush.
Was the American Revolution the only time that early Americans made such statements with their shoes and clothing? I mean, did they use their shoes to make other statements at times?
That is a really very good question. I mean, I think there are other types of statements that shoes made during the time, like the statement, what might shoes tell you about social class and privilege? And there certainly is a lot to be said that would escape us today that could be read in a pair of shoes. So this is not political so much, but it is an understanding of class and society through shoes. So for example, shoes were not at that time generally. There are some pairs that were made right and left, but generally the tradition was it was a straight-lasted shoe, so it could be worn on either the left or the right foot. So straight-lasted actually had an economical value to it. It wasn't that people didn't know about right and left shoes. What it also meant, though, is that as far as women were concerned, if you had a pair of woven silk brocade shoes, you might switch feet so that they would wear evenly on each side, so that the wear pattern would be the same to get you a longer use out of your shoes. However, if you were extremely wealthy, and in my book, I use a pair of shoes in the collection of historic New England that were made by John Hose, you would have them pattern matched. And that meant that the silk, when you were looking at it from the front, it matched right and left, and from the back on the heel. So you couldn't actually switch the shoes. So right away, you were sending a signal about how wealthy you were through your shoes, because if they were pattern matched, it meant you wasted more of the valuable textile in order to match the pattern.
So what else can shoes tell us about a person and their place in early American society? Is there anything from your new research on the shoes enslaved people wore that could tell us more about the lives of enslaved people?
I have to say this is an area that I've just really started working on based on some of the account books that I was going through at sort of at the tail end of this research. I was very interested in the way that the shoes of the enslaved are described by the shoemakers. And there's a whole group of New England shoemakers who are creating after the Revolution, particularly by the 1790s, and then just escalating in the early 19th century, shoes for enslaved workers. And they never mention that language of slave shoes or shoes for slaves, but it's about the quality of the terms and the prices that they assign to the value of the shoes. So they're called sturdy, stout, wide, coarse. And they're sending their shoes rather than local or even regionally, they're sending things to Charleston in Norfolk and so on. And then the numbers increase. And the value of these shoes, some of them were even called cheaps and veals, meaning that it was a very unseasoned leather. So I started looking at how many shoes were being sent, and the volume just explodes compared to the level that this particular shoemaking family was doing, 10 years before that. So I'm just starting to look at it's another area of complicity, really, from the North that has not been discussed. We know about the textile manufacturers, and the cottons and things coming out of Connecticut and so on. But I suddenly realized that, well, shoes, of course, because if you have bad shoes and ill-fitting shoes, as we all know, your day is not comfortable. And if you're working and standing on your feet, so what was going to be the nature of the shoes that were being sent? And they tended to be about a third less in cost than the custom-made bespoke shoes for clients in the area. I was also interested in some references in Sam Lane's accounts to making shoes for a list of a family in Portsmouth. And the husband and wife, the cost of their shoes was X and the cost of the daughter's shoes was Y. And then there was a line about, and for your black girl, shoes made on a man's last. So the idea was a man's last is going to be a different configuration for a foot than for a woman's last, a woman's shoe. So there was that reference, which got me thinking about the style of shoes, the types of shoes, and the cost of the shoes. And then, of course, looking at the Washingtons and the costs of the shoes for the enslaved households also starts to point to, again, a difference of language.
So I've been really struck throughout our conversation by all of the information that we can gather about people in the past just from the shoes they wore. And of course, I know we can gather all of this information because we have examples of fine handmade shoes in museum collections and archives. But what happens after industrialization comes in the 19th century and early Americans aren't wearing handmade shoes, but factory-made shoes? What do factory-made shoes do to our ability to read the past in shoes?
Well, and that's really why I'm fascinated with what happened in the 18th century and actually in the 17th century as well, because by the 19th century, these stories are starting to recede into the background. Some of the stories are the same, the fancy dress shoes, the wedding shoes, the I danced with so-and-so shoes, but the stories involved with the makers are starting to change. So you're not getting necessarily stories about the cordwainers and their ability to try and find the materials for their clientele in times of scarcity. And the bespoke tradition, the custom made, the haute couture that we think of with a brand name shoe, in the 19th century, those are the most expensive shoes. And they are not the shoes that are available for everybody, that have an actual shoemaker who is designing and having them sewn. They tend to be shoes that are being made for world expositions and very, very wealthy clients. What I love about looking at shoes in the 18th century is we get a much more broad spectrum of life and what was happening. I'm just as excited when I find a pair of shoes that shows its wear, that's beaten up, that's made of local materials. In fact, even more so than when I find a pair of silk brocade shoes. So, if it's a shoe that's been hiding in a chimney breast or in a rafter, or if it's one shoe that has been preserved because one of each pair was given to two different children. These are the sorts of stories that you find. In fact, there are countless stories that got left on the cutting room floor, if you will, from this book, because there's actually still so much more to tell.
Yeah, we can tell you've definitely looked at a lot of shoes and a lot of different shoe stories too. And I really think we're going to leave our conversation with you rethinking shoes and how we look at them. Now, shoes are a really fascinating historical source, and given that you have looked at so many different shoes and have thought deeply about shoes, what do you think are the most important or unexpected stories from early America that we can find in shoes?
Yeah, well, I think since I started with that one question about how did these shoes end up in this collection coming from London? So one of the things I've tried to do is explore the travel of a shoe from its place of creation to the feet of its wearer. So I didn't come in, I guess, with a whole series of other than just this sort of general question about what this might mean. And so for me, it was a wonderful process of discovery. I did not expect, for example, to find, while I was familiar with other types of clothing and objects that were part of the non-importation agreements and boycotts and so on, I'd not expected to find such a political aspect attached to shoes. So that was a wonderful surprise. And I'm sure there's even more that I could expand upon that. Another area, though, I think that was particularly near and dear to me is the stories I've been able to uncover about women who otherwise we would know almost nothing about. And that's a big part of what I think very early on I hoped I'd find and have found. So those were two of the main things. But also the other thing I think that I have been left with after all of this research, and not only have I been in, at this point, X number of archives and looked at X number of pairs of shoes, I also talk to people about shoes all the time. I'll tell you, it's a natural icebreaker. I have a bit of social anxiety, and I find if I can turn the conversation to shoes, everybody, men and women, everybody has a shoe story to tell. And so I've also learned a lot about how people view their footwear today and just how much it relates to what our 18th century predecessors went through, the way they thought about their shoes. We think it's so different, but is it really, whether you have a good day or a bad day on your feet, whether your feet get wet, those experiences that we have are the same experiences that they had. So there was a connection, I think, that we can all feel because we all know what it is to have a pair of shoes.
This has been a really fun topic of conversation, and now we need to let the fun continue in the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Now, in Treasures Afoot, Kimberly reminds us that historical archives and museums are created, and that they tend to preference luxury and special objects. So, Kimberly, in your opinion, how might our understanding of early America and the daily life of early Americans be different if archives had shown an equal preference for collecting everyday objects? So in this case, how might our understanding of early America and the daily life of early Americans be different if we had more access to a historical record of everyday shoes?
Right. Well, that is one of my absolute sort of favorite topics with my museum background, because I will say one thing that has changed in museum collections in the last, 10, 20 years is much more of a focus, lining up with what's happening in historians' methodologies and the way we study history, but is now more concerned often with every man and every woman and not just the elite. The problem is that the earlier generations of collecting were largely what we consider connoisseurship. They were beautiful shoes, dainty shoes, pretty shoes, and they would be brought into a collection, maybe with little or no information at all about them. What we're really interested in now, there was a pair of red wool shoes that was recently for sale at Skinner and was purchased at Colonial Williamsburg. And now this pair of New England-made vernacular shoes carries almost as much weight in the auction room as a fancy pair of silk brocade shoes. So there has been a real change, but as you say, the problem is it has not always been approached that way. How many shoes we've lost, the ability to tell a broader story if the collecting patterns had been equal is something that's just incredible to think about, particularly something like the modest Calamanco, the wool shoes. We know that they were the shoes that were worn most often, and yet we have the fewest surviving examples. So it wasn't until I started doing this research, and nobody had really thought about it before, is that our most worn shoe is the kind that's least represented by collections. So that was another point that for me was really, really important to bring up, which is, okay, everybody's wearing Calamanco shoes, and I can only find, 7 pairs, let's say, in all the shoes that I've looked at. So I can only imagine we'd have more red shoes, more red wool shoes. I know that. We probably would have many more women's shoes if we collected with parity. What we probably still wouldn't have, though, would be men's shoes, because men's shoes, certainly from the 1750s on, were generally leather and were basically pretty much worn until there was very little left. We have very few pairs of men's shoes relative to women's. And that would be another thing to think about if you were able to collect with parity.
Earlier, you told us that you were researching the shoes worn by enslaved people. Is this the focus of your primary research project?
That is actually something I'm working on for an article. I don't have a time frame on it because the research that this will involve, I think, will probably be another 5-year, at least, project, because the records are buried in a lot of different places, and extrapolating the information correctly is going to take some time. So that's something that I'm definitely working on for an article, but I have a book coming out with the Massachusetts Historical Society called Fashioning the New England Family, which is a companion piece to an exhibition, and that should be out sometime this spring or summer. But my next big research project is actually looking at a town in northern New Hampshire called Haverhill, New Hampshire, and I'm working with a series of primary sources, some letters, and a 1793 day book, and I've been reconstructing the life of the townspeople in 1793, and it's fascinating.
It does sound fascinating. Now, how can we contact you if we have more questions about the shoes of early America or how historians work with material culture?
Well, I'm on all social media channels, so I'm always happy to answer things on Twitter and Facebook. I have a blog, and the book has, a tremendous amount of information. I think it is a beautiful book, as you've commented, but I think all the stories that I've talked about, there are many more in the book for those who are interested, as well as the sources that I used, the institutions that I visited. As you can imagine, it was very extensive. The research that went into bringing out these stories, it's not just, as we know, lying on the surface. This was a lot of primary source research as well. So those would be my suggestions.
Kimberly Alexander, thank you so much for joining us again and for helping us, shall we say, walk in the fascinating shoes of early America.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking to you again. Thank you for letting me share the shoe stories.
We can learn a lot about the early American past by looking at shoes. As Kimberly highlighted, wear and construction of shoes can tell us about the physical build of a shoe's wearer, whether they walked in a way that favored one leg over another leg, whether they had bunions or some other physical disability that required special shoes. And the textiles cordwainers used to construct shoes can tell us a lot about the economic and social class the wearer belonged to. Were the shoes made of a brocaded silk? If so, the wearer likely had some disposable income or a wealthy friend. Were the shoes made of a heavy, fine-grained leather, or were they made of a worn, coarse-grained leather that looked like they came from other shoe parts? Again, the materials shoemakers use can point to the economic and social class of the wearer. Plus, the construction material and look of a shoe can also tell us something about the wearer's fashion preferences. As Kimberly noted, George Washington's shoe buckles and written orders for shoes reveal that he had a preference for a conservative aesthetic, while Mary Wise Farley's wedding shoes reveal that Mary was a woman who wanted to look beautiful on her wedding day. There are also times when shoes can tell us something about the politics of their maker and wearer. For example, during the years of the Revolution, Mary Viberd preferred shoes that were made in Lynn, Massachusetts, where there were many supporters of the American cause, and she preferred these Lynn-made shoes over shoes she could have imported from London and London-based shoemakers. Now, although shoes can tell us a lot, I think we can see from Kimberly's quest that we need lots of different historical sources to provide us with information. As Kimberly revealed, to find answers to her questions about what shoes can tell us about their maker and wearer, she had to perform a lot of back and forth between the physical shoes she found in museum collections and the written records she found in the archives. Only by using both types of historical records, the written records and the physical objects, was Kimberly able to reveal more about the everyday lives of early Americans. Which just goes to show us that we really need to think expansively and critically about the sources we use to get information about the past. Because different sources can tell us different stories and reveal different types of information about different types of people. Look for more information about Kimberly, her book Treasures Afoot, plus links and notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/244. Looking for some fashionable, high-quality t-shirts, tote bags, and hoodies? Look no further than benfranklinsworld.com/shop, because the Ben Franklin's World shop has you covered. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's Digital Projects team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Emily Sneff, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Our custom theme music was composed by Breakmaster Cylinder. Finally, as we think about objects as something we can read for information about the past, I wonder what objects you have that could tell future historians something interesting about you. So let me know what your objects are. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.